Hey everyone, Jack here. The state of Elden Ring lore analysis is in dire straits. I'm just being a little hyperbolic. But I wanted to talk about something that I think is negatively affecting how we as a community try to analyze and understand the story and lore to Elden Ring. And that is the absence of an informed understanding of one of the primary authors to Elden Ring's world. I recently watched a video, I'm sure you all have seen it, from a very popular YouTuber who produces probably some of the highest quality Souls videos out there, and, you know, one of the forefathers to the genre. And in that video, they were trying to predict what Miquella's role would be in the DLC. And they made references to things like the Formless Odin in Bloodborne to try and think of the Formless Mother. They referenced the manga Berserk to relate Miquella to the character Griffith. But not once did they mention A Song of Ice and Fire or George R.R. Martin's work. I also recently received 2 comments, and one of them said, "I think we overestimate Martin's involvement. He definitely wrote the base of Miquella, but I think Miyazaki does most of everything else." And another one that said, "I feel like you are overestimating George R.R. Martin's work in the story and how the character story play out. I doubt he has anything to do with what Miquella does in the story." So if you're unaware, George R.R. Martin is the critically acclaimed writer of A Song of Ice and Fire, which the show Game of Thrones is an adaptation of. Hidetaka Miyazaki is the lead director on Elden Ring, as well as Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Demon Souls. He's also the president of From Software and, you know, one of the best video game directors of all time. So what I wanted to do is to go through interviews that Miyazaki has done over the years to try and dispel a major misconception on what George R.R. Martin did for Elden Ring. Because I think this misconception is really hurting how we discuss this game. You know, if you're unaware, George R.R. Martin and Hidetaka Miyazaki both wrote the lore, world, and in some senses, the story to Elden Ring. So what we're going to do is we're going to look through these interviews to try and deduce what did George R.R. Martin do and what did Hidetaka Miyazaki do. Right out the gate, though, I want to make a disclaimer that lore does not equal story. Lore is the history of a fictional world. Story is what you do as a character within that world. In the end, though, lore informs the story that is being told. So just right out the gate, so we understand, the story of Elden Ring is what you do as a tarnished player within the world. The lore is the things that happened before the game began. Also to note, I will be sharing the dates of all of these interviews. Elden Ring was released on February 25th, 2022. I will have the sources for these interviews within the description, so if you read something from the author that doesn't seem as informed as it would be today, just remember that these interviews may have occurred more than 2 years ago. Our first interview comes from IGN, June 21st, 2019, after Elden Ring is announced at E3. "It all started with me being a fan of Mr. Martin's work," Miyazaki explained. "A Song of Ice and Fire and its drama adaptation Game of Thrones are both masterpieces. I'm also very fond of Fever Dream and Tough Voyaging. Fever Dream is a book that was written by George R.R. Martin in the 1980s. It features vampires on a Mississippi steamboat in the 1800s, and Tough Voyaging is a series set in George R.R. Martin's Thousand Worlds universe, which is a intergalactic story that takes place thousands of years in the future." From Software approached Martin for a meeting, but Miyazaki originally did not expect that Martin would be willing to meet him so easily. Miyazaki really enjoyed his time with the celebrated author, and immediately felt something clicked. When he proposed the idea to make a game together, he was happy to find out that Martin was all in. "I was really surprised by how smoothly it all went," Miyazaki recalled. Storytelling in video games, at least the way that we do it at From Software, comes with a lot of restrictions for the writer. I didn't think it was a good idea to have Martin write within those restrictions. By having him write about a time that the player isn't directly involved in, he is free to unleash his creativity in the way he likes. Furthermore, as From Software, we didn't want to create a more linear and story-driven experience for Elden Ring. Both issues could be solved by having Martin write about the world's history instead. So, Miyazaki is a fan of George R.R. Martin. He's a fan of many of his books, not just A Song of Ice and Fire, but his vampire and science fiction books. Him and From Software go to George R.R. Martin to ask him to write the lore of Elden Ring. They didn't want to restrict him by telling him to write the story of the game. Don't write what the player will do in the game. Just write the world that the player inhabits. Elden Ring is a From Software game with a main story by Miyazaki and lore from Martin in one package, and while the two might have created their own stories separately, according to Miyazaki, they are heavily influenced by each other. He says that the excitement, drama, and depth of Martin's lore has had a huge impact on From Software's world creation for Elden Ring. It was a fascinating collaboration, as we both weren't restricted by each other, yet still influenced each other's works, he reflected. Miyazaki compared the mythology that Martin wrote for Elden Ring to that of a Dungeon Master's Handbook and a tabletop RPG. As a writer, it must have been a largely different experience for Martin as well. If you're unaware, if you have a Dungeon Master's Handbook for like D&D, that gives you the type of world you'll be playing in, what type of monsters you'll encounter, who are the gods, who are the kings, things of that nature. The character you make for that RPG is your own, but the world that you exist in was written by someone else. A fun example, actually, just as a quick aside, if you've played Baldur's Gate 3 and you've encountered the Githyanki, well, the Githyanki were invented by George R.R. Martin. He wrote them in one of his Thousand Worlds books, and a Dungeon Master hand guide writer for D&D liked what Githyanki were, so he kind of took it from George R.R. Martin and put it into Dungeons & Dragons, so that's a little cute aside. Anyway, back to the interviews. It really is like a guide for the world's lore, and therefore feels quite different from his novels. As someone that loves to learn about a world setting, it was very exciting to read, Miyazaki told me. The player will be able to learn about Martin's mythology through exploration, confirmed Miyazaki. We are known for letting the player explore the game's lore through fragments of environmental storytelling, and this time around, Martin's story is what you will be trying to unravel. The period the player actually explores is still connected to the old times, so you will slowly discover why the world has become the way it is. You will learn more about Martin's mythology as well. So from this, Miyazaki says clearly that we are exploring George R.R. Martin's world, that the world that he created in the old times are heavily connected to the present day that our player character explores. There's no fixed main character in Elden Ring, said Miyazaki. We mostly leave it up to the player to decide the characteristics and personality of the character create. I think that line, it explains to us that George R.R. Martin didn't really have anything to do with the creation of our character. Obviously, the character that you create and you play in-game is your character, so not having his writing restrict who you get to be in the game was very important for Miyazaki. One thing that the Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and even Derasane have in common is that they're all Western fantasy settings. Sekiro was Miyazaki's first game to have a Japanese setting, but for Elden Ring, Miyazaki is going back to his Western fantasy roots. Depending on a game's setting, beauty, justice, and strength all have a different nuance, he mused. With the Japanese setting, those aspects had to be portrayed in a different way. I always want to create worlds with beautiful aesthetic, but the approach towards that goal is always different. While for Elden Ring we are going back to Western fantasy, the game's themes are very different from our previous works, which means that beauty, justice, and strength will be different once again. That difference has a big impact on our games as a whole. Just clarifying that, we can look at an author's work together to understand the major themes and messages that they're trying to tell us, but, we still should try to look at them individualistically. Personally, a world that is happy and bright is something that just doesn't feel realistic to me. It may sound like I have trauma or something, he said, with a laugh, but I believe that the world is generally a wasteland that is not kind to us. That's just the way I see it. Our next interview comes from the New Yorker on February 25th, 2022. Hidetaka Miyazaki sees death as a feature, not a bug. With Elden Ring finally out in the wild, eager players are undoubtedly combing every inch of From Software's new fantasy world to find the influences of writer George R. R. Martin. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones series, was famously brought onto Elden Ring to write the backstory for the in-game universe. But a new interview with The New Yorker, game director Hidetaka Miyazaki revealed that he placed a few key restrictions on what Martin could do. According to Miyazaki, Martin primarily wrote snippets of text about the world's history, its characters, and mythology, including the destruction of the Elden Ring and the subsequent shattering of shards. While this was something we learned previously, Miyazaki further clarified why this was the case. So what's important there is that George R. R. Martin wrote the destruction of the Elden Ring and the scattering of the shards. So if we're going to be looking at the lore and the story of Elden Ring, and we're going to exclude the guy who wrote probably the most pivotal event within the game's narrative, the shattering of the Elden Ring, we're doing ourselves a really big disservice. In our games, the story must always serve the player experience, Miyazaki said. If Martin had written the game's story, I would have worried that we might have to drift from that. I wanted him to be able to write freely and not feel restrained by some obscure mechanic that might have changed in development. From that, I think that what he's trying to say is that if George R. R. Martin wrote what our Tarnished player character does in the game, and he says, oh, well, the Tarnished has to sit at a site of grace beneath this area, and then this will happen, and he has to do this mechanic where he eats a golden seed, and then Miyazaki scraps the mechanic of eating golden seeds, well, then the story kind of gets jumbled. So don't write anything that the player character will be doing, just write about the world before the player character arrives. There's an irony in Martin, an author known for his intrinsic clockwork plots, working with Miyazaki, whose games are defined by their narrative obfuscation. In Dark Souls, a crucial plot detail is more likely to be found in the description of an item in your inventory than in dialogue. It's a technique Miyazaki employs to spark players' imaginations, in the same way that he extracted stories from illustrated fantasy books as a child. The power of imagination is important to me, he said. Offering room for users' interpretations creates a sense of communication with the audience, and of course, communication between users in the community. This is something that I enjoy seeing unfold with our games, and that has continued to influence my work. It's what we're doing right now. By his own admission, Miyazaki is a micromanager. He calls his method total direction, and he can provide input on anything from the style of a costume's buttons to the precise angle of a plunging hillside. I've learned so many things from Miyazaki. Oh, I apologize if I butchered this name. Masanori Warage, a concept artist, told me in 2015. Too many to mention. Miyazaki has opinions on fonts, on menu layout. Miyazaki has opinions on fonts, on menu layouts. He's even performed movements for animations, acting out sequences that are mimed by a game's character. Miyazaki, there are other interviews where he talks about total control, but he really, when it comes down to the final product that we're getting, many artists, many coders, many game designers work on, Elden Ring, Dark Souls, but when the final product is pushed out there, every inch has been approved and, maybe even had Miyazaki's hand in it. It's important that when we're looking at Elden Ring, that we're able to discern what comes from a Miyazaki influence and what comes from a George R. R. Martin influence. Miyazaki, this is the next one. This one is from IGN, posted February 8th. Miyazaki explains working with George R. R. Martin on Elden Ring. It was like speaking with an old friend. Miyazaki said, I knew immediately from talking to him. It just became apparent, his skill and his passion for the fantasy genre, and for games as well. There was a little bit of a generation gap between us, so I felt a bit apprehensive about going to these talks, but after a lot of these conversations, it was just like speaking to an old friend. It just felt so fresh to have this conversation with someone who was so passionate about the same things, and to show that pure joy and sense of curiosity for these fantasy worlds. The two seemingly developed a high level of respect for each other, professionally and personally, and this helped Miyazaki tell Martin that From Software only wanted him to write Elden Ring's history, not the actual story or in-game text. Miyazaki said, we started by giving him these very vague and broad themes and ideas for the mythos that I had swimming around in my head, along with what type of games we typically make. and the sort of themes we like to explore in our games. It was all very loose and quite vague. Then he would come back to us with a lot of ideas. How about this, this, and this? That back and forth started the exchange of ideas. Martin provided Miyazaki and his team with samples of text depicting different parts of Elden Ring, like its history or important figures, along with a sort of backbone to the story of the world. This is highlighting that Miyazaki, he approached George R. R. Martin. He has great level of respect for him. They both respect each other, and they're working collaboratively on creating Elden Ring. Even though Miyazaki has final say, he is working with one of his favorite authors of all time. He once traveled famously to Las Vegas, I think maybe in like 2012. I'll see if I can find the source. Specifically so he could get the Blu-ray of Game of Thrones because it wasn't out in Japan yet. So this is someone that, Miyazaki really respects George R. R. Martin and respects George R. R. Martin's work. And when you have that type of professional respect for someone, it's not so much that you're willing to just take what they've given you and then, throw it all away. There is sentiment value there. There is respect. And this is something that they worked on together. So both of their DNA is within this project. And based on how Miyazaki talks about Martin, it seems like there might have been a lot that wasn't changed. That's some of my speculation, but, just this is what I'm getting from Miyazaki's own words. Developer From Software interpreted these to build an actual game, Miyazaki said, and the issues that Mr. Martin dealt with in his writing provided these motifs for the game itself, so that is something I'm very grateful for. Our next interview comes from Game Informer on January 28th, 2022. George R. R. Martin may be shocked to see what his Elden Ring characters have become. When Martin wrote these characters, and when he provided that origin story, that mythos for the world of Elden Ring, these demigods were much closer to their original form, and maybe closer to human form back then, before the shattering, before it all started. So it was more up to us to interpret this and say, how did they become such inhuman monsters? And how did the mad taint of the shattered shards of the Elden Ring and its power affect them? So that was our job, to take these grand heroes and sort of misshape them and distort them into something they were not, says game director Hidetaka Miyazaki. And I think if we get a chance to show Martin, and if he gets the chance to see the game and see these characters, I think he might be a bit shocked. When he wrote them, he was really envisioning something a little more human, a little bit more traditional human drama and fantasy characters. So I hope he gets a kick out of that. Miyazaki's favorite Martin character in the game? A mysterious figure named Rykard. We don't have any other information on his personality right now, other than the name, but they'll probably be quite a doozy. That process of taking these very human characters with flaws, but these very dramatic, heroic characters, and basically breaking them and making them these misshapen, grotesque monsters, that was a lot of fun for me personally. So, George R. R. Martin wrote who all of the characters were. He wrote Miquella, he wrote Malenia, he wrote Melina, he wrote Marika, he wrote Radagon, he wrote Godfrey, he wrote Rykard, he wrote Godric, he wrote all of these characters. But Miyazaki took these humans and he turned them into boss monsters. He turned Rykard into a giant snake. He gave Godric 100 arms on his back. He made Miquella this forever young Dreamweaver or whatever. But the character at their base, the bones of these characters, the character's motivation, the history to these characters, the betrayals of these characters, the plans for these characters, that's George R. R. Martin. From the Elden Ring Book of Knowledge Volume 2, this is a game guide that was published recently, I think within the past year. Can you tell us about the process you go through when you design an area in Elden Ring? How does designing an open-world area like Limgrave differ from creating a level in one of your previous games? Does lore come first, then geography, then enemies and bosses, or does it vary? Miyazaki speaking. For Elden Ring, area design tended to begin with the lore. This was due to the fascinating mythos penned for us by Mr. Martin. Caelid, for example, is known for being the land where Radahn and Malenia fought at the end of the Shattering, so this was the starting point for the level design, and the visual design as well. This method for designing the world and its parts is unique to Elden Ring, and a major departure from our previous titles. So, to that commenter who said, I don't think George R. R. Martin had much to do with Miquella's story, well, if George R. R. Martin wrote Malenia and Radahn fought in Caelid at the end of the Shattering, Did Miyazaki just have to make up what Miquella wanted Melania to do there? Or did George R. R. Martin write it? You know, you tell me. You know, we're reading the same thing here, so you tell me what's going on. Among all of the enemy and boss designs in Elden Ring, which one are you most fond of, or proudest of created? What were some of the most challenging enemies to implement? Personally, my favorite boss is Radahn. I really like the whole Radahn festival, and the sort of sad, lonely feeling it has. If I were to give a runners-up prize, they would go to Godric and Rykard. Both the design and personality of these two characters are right up my alley. He's talking about these characters like, you know, he didn't write them, like he's relating to them. Godric is great because he understands that he's weak and acknowledges the scorn others feel towards him. Despite this, he still does everything in his power to hold on to what he has. It's this state of being, including his distorted, crazy aspects, that feels very human to me. He's a character whom I can sympathize with on some level. As for Rykard, in a way, I feel that his blasphemous represents one of the strongest wills in Elden Ring. To put in grandiose terms, I find his determination and commitment almost enviable. Ranni the Witch's dual face is one of her most striking features. Was this aspect of her design simply meant to convey that she occupies a body which is not her own, or is there a deeper symbolic meaning behind the left eye of her spirit form overlapping the right eye of the doll she inhabits? There are several meanings behind Ranni's dual face. As you pointed out, she intentionally killed her own body, transferring her soul to a doll, which itself signifies a warped state of existence, similar to how Queen Marika and Radagon are one being. It touches on the nature of Empyreans and the multiple different aspects they can possess. That one, I don't know who wrote that. Was it Martin or Miyazaki? Was it both? You know, think for yourself. Round Table Hold is probably the most enigmatic area in the game. Could you provide some insights into the connection between it and the fortified manor in Leyndell? Is the Round Table Hold affected by the passage of time, since it starts burning when the Erdtree burns? Are these questions to which you have definitive answers? The Round Table Hold is, in a way, a place far removed from the world, though it's modeled after the fortified manor in Leyndell, with its state and power originating from the Erdtree. This is why when the Erdtree burns, the Round Table Hold burns as well. As for the reason behind the Round Table Hold's existence, while there is lore that answer this question, it's something we decided not to touch upon in this game, so I won't be revealing it here either. However, it's safe to say that the two fingers play a key role. That one too, if they start level design with George R. R. Martin's lore, the reason why the Table of Lost Grace, the Round Table Hold, is the way it is, does that originate from George R. R. Martin's lore? Most likely. Did George R. R. Martin write that it is a parallel dimension inside of the Erdtree? Maybe not. But the basis is George R. R. Martin. Let's look at some definitive things that we know that Miyazaki did, in his own words. Elden Ring features a diverse array of unusual characters, but the living jars are particularly unique. When did the concept of sentient pots like Alexander and Jar Baron originate? The living jars, both large and small, were initially made as a simple enemy character. I enjoy this sort of character, where I can do a quick sketch and design team instantly gets it. I feel they help lend a variety to the lore and art style, and they contrast well with characters that have more complex designs. From these simple enemies came Alexander as an NPC, and Jar Baron after that. I actually don't really remember how it all came to be. I have a vague memory of explaining it quite plainly as part of an NPC interaction without giving it too much thought. I suppose the team accepted it without any sort of objections, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The Moonlight Altar is one of the most visually striking areas in the game, even when viewed from a great distance away in the lowlands of Liurnia. Can you share any insights into this area's design or its artistic inspiration? The main design points for the Moonlight Altar was to be a place that exhibited a sense of mystery separate from that of the Erdtree. The colors, details, and other various design elements were intended to be distinct from those of the Erdtree, which may give it a different impression overall. The other reason is that we are simply very fond of moonlight and the tranquil loneliness associated with it. We always enjoy depicting moonlight in our games if we can find room to do so. So, things like Moonlight Altar, things like Alexander and the Jar Baron, the Living Pots, these are firmly Miyazaki creations. But that could just mean Martin wrote the Carians as some royal house who had their own goals and their own religion, and it could have been whatever. They could have been, You know, they could have come from the ocean and they could have worshipped turtles. Instead, Miyazaki loves moonlight. Him and the team love to moonlight and to portray moonlight. They can change it so that it's now the moon. This royal family who worshipped a different god and had different reliefs and different rituals, they worship the moon. At the bones, the motivation, the alien origin, alien as different, not as space aliens, and the conflict between, you know, Erdtree and Carians is a Martin creation. However, the window dressing of Golden Tree and Full Moon doesn't have to be his. That is to say, when we're trying to analyze the story, it's important to know who wrote the motivations for these characters. You know, otherwise we're arguing about window dressing. While important to the themes to understand and to appreciate the art, we're missing the forest for the trees when we kind of just look from that perspective. And I know some of you are going to come for me for this, so I prepared for it. I don't know if any of you have read Romeo and Juliet, but one of my favorite lines is, What's in a name, that which we call a rose, by any other word would smell as sweet? So this is from an interview from IGN. I don't have the date. Elden Ring, how From Software's largest, most freeform map works. Throughout our interview, Miyazaki talked about Elden Ring's setting, the lands between, and the importance of having massive worlds players can freely explore. The Lands Between is actually a name that was invented by George R.R. Martin himself when he was coming up for the impetus for this world and writing its history and its deep mythos. And we hope that as well as taking away the idea of it being a sort of impetus and a starting place for the world, we want people to feel that it's really like an invitation to this mysterious new land. So for Miyazaki himself, George R.R. Martin wrote the name to the Lands Between. Why does he specify that George R.R. Martin wrote the name to the Lands Between? Well, that's because other names have changed. I had one commenter say, you think George R.R. Martin made Miquella? Well, have you played Dark Souls 2? In Dark Souls 2, there is the Grand Spirit Tree Shield. Its description is, shield of the blue spirit tree that and is said to possess divine powers. Jeez, Dark Souls 2 is weird writing. Appears in the allegory of Miquella, god of dream, and can deflect spells by parrying. Once there was a boy who was easily frightened, until the talking tree of the dream world transformed itself into a shield to protect him. Well, there you go. Miquella is really just Kayla, god of dream, from Dark Souls 2, and the Grand Spirit Tree Shield is the Halig Tree. Or these are names that Miyazaki and From Software changed George R. R. Martin's characters to. In a blog post on George R. R. Martin's Not a Blog from March 21st, 2022, he says, "Oh, and as long as I'm setting stuff straight, there's a weird story all over the internet about how I hid my initials in Elden Ring because some of the characters' names, some of them have names beginning with R or G or M, to which I say, what, really? This is news to me. I've been writing and publishing stories since 1971, and I suspect that I've been giving character names beginning with R and G and M since the start, along with the other 23 letters of the alphabet as well. Coming up with names is hard, especially since A Song of Ice and Fire uses so many of them, and I'm fond of giving family members and close kin names that have something in common. But really, why would I have hid my name inside the game? My name is right on the game. As one of the creators, hey, Elden Ring is exciting enough. No need to make stuff up." George R. R. Martin didn't put his name, his initials in the game. That's because he didn't name Ratigan. He didn't name Marika. He didn't name Miquella. He didn't name Radon. Miyazaki did. George R. R. Martin wrote other names, and Miyazaki changed them. Miyazaki didn't change the name of the Lands Between, because that name was significant enough to George R. R. Martin that it shouldn't be changed, but the names of characters changed. And that's where we go back to Romeo and Juliet. What's in a name? That's what we call a rose. By any other word would smell as sweet. It doesn't matter if you call a rose or not. It's still a rose. Doesn't matter if Miquella is named Miquella, named after Quela, god of dream. And it doesn't matter if Miquella's name is Bran Stark. What matters is what the characters do and what the motivations of these characters are. Lastly, we go to Shadow of the Erdtree. This was an interview done by IGN not too long ago. Switching gears for a second, one of the big news points I think of Elden Ring was that the scenario was written by George R.R. Martin. Did he have any kind of role in planning of Shadow of the Erdtree? And if so, just out of curiosity, have you talked to him since the game has come out, and has he had any kind of reaction to the outstanding success of this game? The way George Martin's story has been incorporated is the same as it has with the base game of Elden Ring. And to avoid any misunderstanding there, we just want to point out that he hasn't written anything exclusively and new for the sake of this DLC. But it would still be fair to say that he and his mythos that he created for us are involved in the creation of Shadow of the Erdtree in the same way. And the reason for that is that in making the base game and making Elden Ring, we took from that mythos, but we only took one part of it. We took from a part that created the story of Elden Ring and created the world that we wanted to envision. And the Shadow of the Erdtree is yet another part of that original mythos that he wrote, and that has inspired us to create the story of this DLC. So, just like the base game that we've been playing for the past 2 years, the upcoming DLC is going to function much the same way. And this is kind of where I go to that the lore community is doing itself a disservice, because we have decades upon decades of this seminal author's work. I don't know if I used the word seminal properly there. That we can pull from to better understand Elden Ring. George R. R. Martin's work is it's good. You know, it's fun to read. You don't have to read it to understand Elden Ring, but it helps. And, you know, you do yourself a disservice if you attack others or put down others who try to take the viewpoint of the co-author of the game and use that as a way to interpret it. You're also, you know, you kind of just, you miss out. There's a really great story in Elden Ring. And when you only try to look at one half of it, you're missing it. I want to give an example of one of the direct influences I think that George R. R. Martin had on the game, as well as a character that we can kind of break down to see what part did George R. R. Martin write and which part did Miyazaki write. For Godric, George R. R. Martin most likely wrote Godric the Golden, don't worry about his names, was the last of a long line of kings, of royalty. He dated his ancestry all the way back to the first king of the kingdom. But due to a succession crisis in the capital, someone claiming to be the true son of the first king usurped the throne. Godric gets expelled from the capital, and this veiled monarch named Morgoth takes over. Searching for power in the past, Godric starts covering himself with the symbols of the first Elden Lord Godfrey. He gilds everything in gold, paints the shields gold, the weapons gold, the surcoats they wear show beast and tree. He essentially covers himself in the original coat of arms. So barring any names, Martin most likely wrote all of that. What did Miyazaki write? Well, I need to turn this guy into a boss monster. He's covering himself with the coat of arms of the first king, the first Elden Lord Godfrey. Well, in our game, Godfrey is the first Tarnished as well. So Godric is really going to put himself in Godfrey's coat of arms by cutting off the limbs of Tarnished and grafting them to his body. He's literally wearing a coat of arms to prove that he is the blood of the first Tarnished, Godfrey. It's, when we look at it in those pieces, like, that creativity is amazing. How did Miyazaki come up with that? How did George R. R. Martin come up with that? That's a lot of fun. Another is a comparison between characters within some of George R. R. Martin's other work and Elden Ring. The hot topic right now is Miquella and Mohg. What are they up to? Well, in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, if you've seen the show, there is a character who is not abducted, but brought into this underground cave with tree roots all over the place. The person who abducts him, not abducts him, the person who hosts him in this cave, his name is Bloodraven. He is a bastard born of the Targaryen line, and he's described as having a root coming out of his eye, or going into his eye. So he's only one eye. His other eye is red. It's bloodshot red. Bran is very powerful. He is a green seer and a warg. He can see through the trees, and as we learn through Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire, he can see back in time, and he can also control people. In a way, he can bewitch people. If you know Hold the Door, you know, that's the ultimate bewitching. Bloodraven and the Children of the Forest, underground, in these tree roots, they feed, in the books at least, they feed Bran this essentially blood porridge to enhance his powers. So we have this very powerful young boy who has the ability to control other people, and we have this man named Bloodraven who is a bastard born of the Targaryen lineage, is missing an eye, and is feeding this child blood porridge to make him more powerful. For what goals we do not know, but that's what he's doing. Let's look at Elden Ring. I made a video that Miquella is not Griffith and that Mohg is actually Griffith. Well, I was a little tongue-in-cheek because neither of them are Griffith. Mohg is a omen who is essentially a bastard. He is hidden underground because he's not supposed to be known to the world. He cannot claim any titles as an omen. He abducts Miquella and brings him to Mogwyn Dynasty. Instead of feeding him blood porridge, he slathes his cocoon in blood to raise him as an Empyrean so he may become God. Mohg has a horn, an omen horn, going into his head and piercing an eye, and in his second phase, he spouts raven wings. He's literally a blood raven. Blood and raven wings. Blood raven from A Song of Ice and Fire. In turn, that would make Miquella Bran Stark, and that's a whole nother video. But you can kind of see where, you know, Miquella may look like Griffith. He may look like Griffith from the legendary manga Berserk, which Miyazaki and myself both love. Miyazaki may have read whatever character that George R.R. Martin gave him and said, well, I think this character is much like Griffith. I'm going to make him look like Griffith. I'm going to describe him a bit like Griffith. I'm going to give him a tree capital like Griffith. I'm going to make him have dreams like Griffith. But that doesn't make him Griffith. And it also doesn't make him Bran Stark. It makes him Miquella, the combination of the two. Although not original, it is still unique. And when it comes to mimics, they don't need to be original to be unique. Thank you for watching. If you like my video, please consider watching some of my other videos. The next one I'm working on is the sequel to the Eclipse video, which follows the Black Swordsman as he tries to uncover how Miquella has been manipulating the entire story of Elden Ring since the very beginning, and why he was chosen by Torrent. If you haven't, please watch the Eclipse video, because that will prepare you for the sequel. It's going to be really good and a lot of fun. You can also become a member on my channel. So far, I don't have any members-only videos yet, but I wanted to do kind of a rough draft video series talking about the comparisons between George R.R. Martin's work and Elden Ring. Those will be videos that will come out after the Shadow of the Erdtree as full, earnest, high-quality edited videos, but right now I want to do just maybe rough drafts every few weeks, just to give you guys an idea. I hope you don't think I came off as, like, contrarian for the sake of it or rude for the sake of it. I just think, you know, this is a piece of art I love, and I'm sure many of you love too, and I just want us to be able to talk about it in the fullest extent, because it deserves it. It's a really, really great piece of art, and I don't want us to be doing a disservice by ignoring what we can learn and what we can ascertain from inspecting what one of the co-authors did for the story. So, long video, read a lot, hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next one.